In 1861, America did not march into war. It fell into it, not against a foreign enemy, but against itself. Brothers aimed rifles at brothers. Fathers never returned home. Over 600,000 lives would be erased, not in some distant land, but on American soil. This war was not just about land or politics. It was about chains and freedom, power and survival, and a single question that nearly destroyed a nation. Can a country built on liberty survive while denying it to millions? What happened between 1861 and 1865 did more than end slavery. It redefined what America is forever. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. In the spring of 1861, the United States was not yet a united country. It was a fragile experiment, less than a century old, held together by promises, compromises, and unresolved sins. Beneath the flag and the Constitution lay a deep and growing wound: slavery, power, the meaning of freedom itself. This is the story of the American Civil War, not just a war of generals and battles, but a war of people, families, and souls, a nation on the edge. For decades, America had argued with itself in courtrooms and churches, in Congress and cotton fields. Was this a nation where all men are created equal? Or a nation built on human bondage? By 1860, the answer could no longer be delayed. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president, Southern states believed their way of life was under threat. One by one, they seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. And then on April 12, 1861, cannon fire echoed over Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The war had begun, brothers against brothers. What followed was not a distant conflict fought by professionals. It was a civil war in the truest sense. Neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. Young men left farms, factories, and classrooms, believing the war would be short. They marched off with songs and flags, unaware they were stepping into the bloodiest chapter in American history. By the end, more than 600,000 soldiers would die, more than in all other U.S. wars combined up to that point. They died not only from bullets and cannon fire, but from disease, hunger, and exposure. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Amputations were performed without anesthesia. Letters home spoke of courage, but also fear, doubt, and despair. Fields of fire and steel, the names of battles still echo through history. Bull Run, where illusions of a quick victory were shattered. Antietam, the single bloodiest day in American history. Gettysburg, 3 days that decided the fate of the nation. At places like Shiloh, Fredericksburg, and Cold Harbor, the ground was soaked with blood. Soldiers charged into rifle fire and artillery barrages that no human body could withstand. This was a new kind of war, industrial, relentless, merciless, the human cost. But beyond the battlefields were the civilians. Cities burned. Farms were destroyed, families were displaced, women became nurses, factory workers, and heads of households. Children grew up too fast, or not at all. And for enslaved African Americans, the war was something else entirely. It was hope. As Union armies advanced, enslaved people fled plantations, risking death for a chance at freedom. Many joined the fight themselves. Nearly 180,000 black soldiers served in the Union Army, proving their courage on battlefields where they were often treated as expendable. Their struggle transformed the war, Lincoln, and the meaning of freedom. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring freedom for enslaved people in Confederate-held territories. It did not end slavery overnight, but it changed the soul of the war. The conflict was no longer only about preserving the Union. It was about redefining it. At Gettysburg, Lincoln spoke words that would outlive the war itself. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. It was a promise written in blood, the war's end. By 1864, the war had become a war of endurance. Union General Ulysses S. Grant pressed the Confederacy relentlessly. General William Tecumseh Sherman marched through Georgia, destroying the South's ability to fight. Finally, on April 9, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The guns fell silent, but peace was fragile. Just days later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, struck down at the very moment the nation needed healing most. A changed nation. The Civil War ended slavery. It preserved the Union, but it left scars that would last generations. Reconstruction would be painful. Racial injustice would persist. The promise of equality would remain unfinished Yet from the ashes of war, a new America emerged, more powerful, more unified, and forever transformed. Final reflection. The American Civil War was not just a fight for land or laws. It was a struggle over identity. Who are we? What do we stand for? And what are we willing to sacrifice to make those words real? The answers were written between 1861 and 1865, in mud-soaked trenches, in whispered prayers, and in the quiet grief of those left behind. It was a war that broke a nation and painfully, slowly helped rebuild it. In the decades before the first shots were fired, the United States lived with a contradiction at its core. It called itself the land of liberty, yet millions of human beings were held in chains. This contradiction was not hidden. It was argued over relentlessly, whispered about in polite society, shouted about in Congress, and enforced with violence in the fields and streets of the South. Slavery was not merely a social issue. It was an economic engine, a political weapon, and a moral fault line that ran through every institution of the nation. From the very beginning, America had tried to balance the unbalanceable. Compromises were written into law to keep free states and slave states equal in power. Lines were drawn across maps to decide where slavery could exist and where it could not, as if human freedom could be contained by geography. Each compromise bought time, but none brought peace. Every generation inherited the same unresolved question. Was slavery a temporary evil or a permanent foundation of American prosperity? In the southern states, slavery became inseparable from identity and power. Vast plantations depended on enslaved labor, and the wealth generated by cotton fed not only southern elites, but also northern factories and European markets. Southern leaders argued that their economy, their culture, and their political survival depended on the institution. To them, any threat to slavery was a threat to their very existence. They spoke of states' rights, local sovereignty, and constitutional protections, framing slavery not as a moral issue, but as a legal one. In the North, opposition to slavery took many forms. Some saw it as a moral abomination, incompatible with the nation's founding ideals. Others feared its expansion would undermine free labor and opportunity for white workers. Still others were indifferent, content to benefit economically while avoiding the human cost. The North was not unified in righteousness, but it was increasingly unified in resistance to slavery's spread into new territories. The battle lines were forming long before armies did. Every new territory acquired by the United States reignited the conflict. Would it enter the Union free or enslaved? Each decision shifted the balance of power in Congress, and power meant survival. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act were all attempts to delay the inevitable. Instead, they inflamed tensions further. Kansas descended into violence as pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers fought to determine its future, earning the grim name Bleeding Kansas. The courts failed to heal the divide. In 1857, the Dred Scott decision declared that African Americans could not be citizens and that Congress had no authority to restrict slavery in the territories. For the South, it was a victory. For the North, it was proof that the system was rigged in favor of slavery. Trust between regions eroded rapidly, replaced by suspicion and fear. At the center of this storm stood the question of power. Slavery was not just about labor, it was about who controlled the nation's future. Southern states feared becoming a permanent minority, outvoted and outmatched by a growing North. They believed that once slavery was contained, it would be destroyed, and with it their political influence. Northern states feared a slave power conspiracy, a belief that wealthy slaveholders were manipulating the government to protect their interests at all costs. The election of 1860 brought these fears into sharp focus. Abraham Lincoln did not call for the immediate abolition of slavery where it already existed, but he opposed its expansion. To the South, this was unacceptable. Lincoln's victory without a single Southern electoral vote convinced many that their voice no longer mattered within the Union. Secession became, in their minds, an act of self-preservation. South Carolina led the way, followed by other Southern states. They declared that the Union had failed them, that the federal government had become hostile to their way of life. They formed the Confed. Irate states of America built explicitly on the preservation of slavery. Their declarations made it clear slavery was not incidental. It was central. In the North, secession was seen as rebellion. The Union was not a voluntary association to be abandoned. When inconvenient, it was a nation. Allowing states to leave would mean the collapse of democratic government itself. Lincoln faced an impossible choice: accept the dissolution of the Union or defend it by force. Either path promised suffering. Ordinary Americans were caught between ideologies they did not create but would be asked to die for. Farmers, clerks, laborers, and students listened to speeches about honor, rights, and destiny, often without fully understanding how deeply slavery and power were intertwined. Many believed the conflict would be brief, a show of strength that would restore order. Few imagined the scale of destruction that lay ahead. Enslaved people understood the stakes more clearly than anyone. For them, the debate was not abstract. It was about families torn apart, lives controlled by violence, and futures stolen before they could begin. Every political argument, every compromise, every election carried the weight of their survival. The nation debated their fate while denying their humanity. As the year 1861 began, the United States was no longer merely divided in opinion. It was divided in purpose, in loyalty, and in vision. One side believed slavery was essential and protected by law. The other believed its expansion threatened the nation's soul. Between them stood a constitution strained to its limits and a people running out of patience. When the first cannon fired, it was not the beginning of the conflict, but the collapse of restraint. The war that followed was the violent answer to a question America had refused to resolve peacefully, a question about whether a nation founded on liberty could survive while denying that liberty to millions, and whether power rooted in human bondage could coexist with a democratic ideal built on freedom. When the war began, it did not arrive as a distant thunder, but as a personal rupture that tore through households and communities. The American Civil War was not fought on foreign soil by professional armies detached from civilian life. It was fought by men who had grown up together, who shared the same churches, schools, and bloodlines, now wearing different uniforms and aiming rifles at familiar faces. In countless cases, brothers found themselves on opposite sides, divided not by hatred but by geography, loyalty, and circumstance. Young men enlisted with confidence and conviction. Many believed the war would be over within months, that one decisive battle would settle the dispute. They marched away amid cheering crowds, brass bands, and waving flags, carrying ideals of honor, duty, and courage. Mothers watched their sons disappear down dusty roads, clinging to the belief that sacrifice would be brief and meaningful. Few understood that they were witnessing the last moments of innocence for an entire generation. Reality arrived quickly and brutally. The first major battles shattered any illusion of glory, smoke-filled fields, deafening cannon fire, and the screams of the wounded replaced patriotic songs. Soldiers learned that courage did not protect them from many balls that shattered bones or artillery shells that erased bodies entirely. Men fell not as heroes frozen in time, but as terrified human beings calling for help that often never came. The nature of warfare itself magnified the suffering. Advances in weaponry outpaced tactics, turning open field charges into mass slaughter. Rifled muskets made killing efficient at long distances, while generals still relied on strategies from earlier wars. Entire regiments were cut down in minutes. Survivors carried the memories forever, if they survived at all. Death was not always immediate. Wounded soldiers lay for hours or days on the battlefield, exposed to the elements, bleeding, thirsty, and alone. Medical knowledge was limited, sanitation nearly non-existent. Surgeons worked tirelessly in makeshift hospitals, performing amputations by the thousands to prevent infection. The sound of saws cutting through bone became one of the war's most haunting rhythms. Survival often depended not on bravery but on luck. Disease claimed more lives than combat. Dysentery, typhoid, pneumonia, and malaria swept through camps where men lived in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Soldiers who had never fired a shot died slowly in tents far from home. Letters sent home spoke of longing, fear, and exhaustion. Words often written with trembling hands. Many families received their last message weeks after the writer had already been buried in an unmarked grave. For those who survived, the psychological toll was immense. There was no language yet for trauma, no understanding of what endless violence did to the mind. Men returned from battles changed, haunted by images they could not escape. Nightmares, emotional numbness, sudden rage, and deep sorrow followed them long after the fighting paused. Some never returned home at all, choosing instead to drift west or disappear into cities where no one knew their past. The war's reach extended far beyond the front lines. Families endured years of uncertainty, waiting for news that might never come. Wives learned to manage farms and businesses alone. Children grew up without fathers or with fathers who returned as strangers. Communities that once gathered for celebrations now gathered for funerals again and again until grief became a constant presence. Women bore an enormous share of the burden. They became nurses, caring for the wounded under horrific conditions, often without formal training. They washed blood-soaked uniforms, comforted dying soldiers, and wrote final letters dictated by men too weak to hold a pen. At home, women kept households alive amid shortages and inflation, stretching meager resources while fearing every knock at the door. Enslaved families suffered a different but equally devastating loss. Husbands and sons were sold away or forced to labor for the war effort. When freedom finally came within reach, it often arrived through chaos and danger. Many fled plantations under cover of night, risking capture or death. Others followed Union armies carrying children and hope with equal fragility. Freedom did not erase trauma, and the war left scars that emancipation alone could not heal. Civilians in war zones lived with constant fear. Armies marched through towns, requisitioning food, burning crops, and destroying infrastructure. Homes became hospitals, churches became morgues, and schools became barracks. The line between soldier and civilian blurred until no one felt safe. The war entered kitchens, bedrooms, and fields, transforming ordinary life into a struggle for survival. Even victory carried grief. When the fighting finally slowed, the scale of loss became undeniable. Nearly every family had been touched by death or suffering. Cemeteries expanded rapidly, filling with rows of identical markers bearing names, numbers, or nothing at all. The nation mourned, but it did not mourn together. Each side carried its own version of loss, its own memories of sacrifice and betrayal. For many, the hardest moment came not during battle, but afterward, when silence replaced chaos. The absence of those who would never return was felt in empty chairs, unfinished conversations, and lives permanently altered. The war had demanded everything: youth, health, innocence, and faith, and it had given nothing back except survival. The American Civil War reshaped the meaning of loss on a national scale. It taught a generation that ideals could demand unbearable costs, and that survival itself could feel like a burden. The people who lived through it carried the weight of those years in their bodies and memories long after the uniforms were folded away, long after the guns were quiet, long after the country tried to move forward while millions silently counted the names of those who never came home. The American Civil War was shaped not by a single clash of armies, but by a series of battles that slowly and violently redirected the course of the nation. Each confrontation left behind more than casualties and shattered landscapes. It altered political will, public morale, and the understanding of what victory would require. The war's outcome was written step by step across fields, rivers, and towns that became symbols of sacrifice and turning points in a struggle no one could fully control. The first major test came early. At Bull Run in July 1861, civilians traveled from Washington to watch what they assumed would be a brief and decisive engagement. They brought picnic baskets and binoculars, expecting spectacle rather than slaughter. Instead, confusion and panic swept the field. When Union forces collapsed and retreated, the illusion of an easy war vanished. The battle revealed how unprepared both sides were and how deadly modern warfare had become. It sent a shock through the North and emboldened the South, ensuring that compromise would no longer be possible. As the war spread westward, the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862 delivered a brutal awakening. Fighting erupted suddenly in the Tennessee wilderness, catching Union forces off guard. For 2 days, men fought at close range amid trees and ravines, the ground soaked with blood. The casualty numbers stunned the nation. Shiloh proved that the war would be long and merciless, that neither side could avoid enormous loss. It hardened attitudes and erased lingering hopes that restraint or limited engagement might bring a quick resolution. Along the Eastern Theater, the struggle for momentum continued. Antietam, fought in September 1862, became the bloodiest single day in American history. From the cornfield to the sunken road and Burnside's bridge, soldiers advanced and fell in relentless waves. No clear tactical victory emerged, but the strategic impact was immense. The battle halted the Confederate invasion of the North and gave the Union something it desperately needed: the appearance of success. This moment allowed Abraham Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, transforming the war's purpose and redefining what victory meant. Fredericksburg followed, a stark example of leadership failure and human cost. Union troops were ordered to march acro SS open ground into entrenched Confederate positions. Wave after wave advanced under devastating fire, knowing the outcome yet obeying orders. The result was catastrophic. The field was littered with bodies, and cries of the wounded echoed through the cold night. Fredericksburg crushed Northern morale and demonstrated how tactical decisions could waste lives without gaining ground, deepening public despair and anger. The war reached a critical crossroads in July 1863 at Gettysburg. For 3 days, armies clashed across rolling hills and small farms in Pennsylvania. The battle unfolded as a series of desperate engagements, each one influencing the next. The fighting at Little Round Top, the carnage in the wheat field, and the doomed charge across open ground that would later be known as Pickett's Charge defined the limits of courage and endurance. When the smoke cleared, The Confederate Army had been repelled, and its hope of forcing a decisive victory on Northern soil was gone. Gettysburg marked the high water mark of the Confederacy. Simultaneously, far to the west, the fall of Vicksburg split the Confederacy in two. Control of the Mississippi River was vital, and the Union's success there isolated southern states and crippled supply lines. The victory demonstrated the importance of strategy beyond individual battles. It showed that the war would be won not only through bravery, but through coordination, logistics, and sustained pressure. Together, Gettysburg and Vicksburg shifted the balance of power decisively toward the Union. As the war continued, its character evolved. Battles became less about grand maneuvers and more about attrition. Grant's overland campaign in 1864 reflected this change. Engagements like the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor were marked by relentless fighting and staggering casualties. Soldiers dug trenches, foreshadowing a new style of warfare defined by endurance rather than movement. The cost was immense, but the Union's strategy was clear: wear down the Confederacy until it could no longer fight. In the South, Sherman's march through Georgia demonstrated another transformation. His campaign targeted not just armies, but the economic and psychological foundations of the Confederacy. Railroads were destroyed, crops burned, and infrastructure dismantled. The goal was to break the will to continue fighting by making the cost undeniable. For civilians caught in the path of the march, the war became intensely personal. The message was clear: no part of society was untouched by the conflict. Each battle reshaped public understanding of the war. Early optimism gave way to grim determination. Victories brought relief, but also reminded people of the lives paid in exchange. Defeats intensified political divisions and tested faith in leadership. Newspapers reported casualty lists that stretched for pages, forcing communities to confront the reality of loss on an unprecedented scale. By the time the final campaigns unfolded, the nation had been fundamentally altered by cumulative weight of these battles. They had stripped away romantic notions of warfare and replaced them with a sobering awareness of its cost. The fields where men fought became landmarks not just of military history, but of national identity. They stood as reminders that the country's future had been decided not in a single moment, but through countless acts of endurance and sacrifice, each battle pushing the nation closer to an outcome that had once seemed unimaginable. At the heart of the American Civil War lay a transformation far deeper than shifting battle lines or political control. It was a struggle that slowly evolved into a fight over human freedom itself, reshaping the meaning of the war as it unfolded. What began as a conflict to preserve the Union became, through sacrifice and necessity, a moral reckoning with slavery and the lives bound by it. At the start of the war, freedom for enslaved people was not the central objective of the federal government. Abraham Lincoln understood the fragile balance holding the Union together and feared that immediate abolition would drive border states into the Confederacy. For many in the North, the war was about restoring national unity, not dismantling an entire social and economic system. Yet for millions of enslaved African Americans, the war was already about freedom, whether the nation admitted it or not. As Union armies moved deeper into Southern territory, enslaved people began taking freedom into their own hands. They fled plantations, crossed rivers, and followed advancing troops, often with nothing but the clothes they wore. They arrived at Union camps exhausted, frightened, and determined. At first they were labeled contraband, a term that reduced human beings to confiscated property. But even this status offered a path away from bondage. Their presence forced the Union to confront the reality that the war could not be separated from slavery. These men, women, and children carried with them stories of brutality and loss. Families had been torn apart by sale, punishment, and forced labor. Freedom, when it came, was uncertain and dangerous. Slave catchers, Confederate patrols, and hunger stalked every step. Still, The risk was worth taking because remaining meant a lifetime of control and suffering. Their movement toward Union lines became a quiet but powerful rebellion, undermining the Southern labor system from within. Pressure mounted on Lincoln to clarify the war's purpose. Abolitionists demanded action, while military leaders recognized that slavery sustained the Confederate war effort. Enslaved labor built fortifications, grew food, and maintained infrastructure. Striking at slavery meant striking at the Confederacy's ability to fight. The moral and strategic arguments began to align, pushing the nation toward a turning point. In January 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation took effect. It declared freedom for enslaved people in Confederate-held territories, reshaping the character of the war. Though limited in immediate reach, its symbolic power was immense. The war was no longer only about preserving a nation, but about redefining it. Freedom became an official objective, and the conflict took on a moral clarity it had previously lacked. The proclamation also transformed international perception. European powers that had considered recognizing the Confederacy now hesitated. Supporting a nation built on slavery became politically and morally untenable. The Union's cause gained new legitimacy, and the war assumed global significance as a struggle over human rights and democratic ideals. Perhaps the most profound change came with the enlistment of black soldiers. Once barred from service, African Americans were now allowed to fight for their own liberation. Nearly 180,000 black men joined the Union Army, along with thousands more in the Navy. They fought not only Confederate forces, but prejudice within their own ranks. Paid less, given harsher assignments, and often denied proper equipment, they nonetheless proved their courage on battlefields across the South. For these soldiers, the stakes were absolute. Capture could mean death or a return to slavery. Confederate forces often refused to treat them as prisoners of war, executing them instead. Still, they fought on, knowing that victory offered not only personal freedom, but the hope of a future for generations to come. Their service challenged deeply held assumptions about race and citizenship, forcing the nation to confront its contradictions. Freedom, however, was not a single moment, but a fragile process. As enslaved people gained liberation, they faced enormous obstacles. They had no land, little protection, and few resources. Families searched desperately for loved ones lost through sale or displacement. Education, long denied, became a powerful symbol of hope. Churches and schools emerged as centers of community, resilience, and aspiration. The passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865 formally abolished slavery throughout the United States. It marked a legal end to an institution that had defined the nation since its founding. Yet the amendment could not erase the damage inflicted by centuries of bondage. Freedom existed on paper, but equality remained contested. Violence, discrimination, and economic exploitation continued to shape the lives of newly freed people. The fight for freedom during the Civil War reshaped the nation's understanding of itself. It exposed the gap between ideals and reality, forcing Americans to confront what their words truly meant. Liberty was no longer an abstract principle, but a lived experience earned through struggle and sacrifice. The war expanded the definition of who belonged to the nation and who had the right to claim its promises. For enslaved people, emancipation was both an ending and a beginning. It closed the door on legalized ownership of human beings, but opened an uncertain future filled with challenges. The legacy of their fight endured not only in laws and amendments, but in memory and identity. Their courage altered the course of the war and the nation itself, proving that freedom was not simply granted by proclamation, but seized through persistence, resilience, and an unyielding belief in human dignity. When the fighting finally slowed and the guns fell silent, the United States that emerged from the Civil War was not the same nation that had entered it. The Union had survived, but survival came at a cost so immense that it reshaped the country's political structure, social fabric, and collective memory. Preservation of the Union was not merely a military outcome. It was a transformation that altered how Americans understood nationhood, authority, and belonging. Before the war, the United States was often spoken of as a collection of states loosely bound together. Loyalty was local, and national identity remained fragile. The Civil War changed that relationship forever. The defeat of secession established that the Union was permanent, not a temporary agreement that could be abandoned at will. Federal authority emerged stronger than ever, asserting its power over states that had claimed the right to leave. This shift redefined the balance between state sovereignty and national unity, creating a more centralized nation. The victory of the Union also confirmed that democratic government could endure internal rebellion. The idea that a republic could collapse under pressure had haunted political thinkers for decades. By surviving its greatest internal crisis, the United States sent a message to the world that democracy, though fragile, was resilient. The nation proved it could confront its own contradictions through conflict and still remain intact. Yet the cost of that survival was written across the landscape and the population. Entire regions lay devastated, particularly in the South. Cities were ruined, railroads destroyed, farms abandoned, and economies shattered. Wealth that had taken generations to build vanished in a few short years. Recovery would be slow and uneven, leaving lasting resentment and hardship that shaped regional identity long after the war ended. The people themselves carried the deepest scars. Millions returned home wounded in body and spirit. Amputees struggled to find work in a society unprepared to support them. Widows and orphans faced uncertain futures. The emotional toll lingered in silence as veterans tried to reconcile memories of violence with the demands of peace. The nation honored their sacrifice, but often failed to heal their wounds. Politically, the war expanded the role of the federal government in daily life. To fight the conflict, the government had introduced income taxes, a national banking system, and mass conscription. These measures did not disappear with peace. They became part of a modern state capable of mobilizing resources on a national scale. The relationship between citizens and the government was permanently altered, binding individuals more closely to national institutions. The end of slavery marked one of the most profound changes in American history. 4 million people emerged from bondage into freedom, transforming the social order of the South and challenging the nation to live up to its ideals. The Union victory ensured that the country would move forward without slavery, but it did not guarantee justice or equality. The struggle over what freedom truly meant began anew, this time without chains but still constrained by power and prejudice. Reconstruction offered a moment of possibility. Constitutional amendments redefined citizenship and promised equal protection under the law. African Americans participated in political life, voting, holding office, and building institutions of their own. For a brief period, the nation attempted to remake itself on the principles of inclusion and rights. Resistance, however, was fierce. Violence, intimidation, and legal barriers undermined these gains, revealing how deeply divided the country remained despite military victory. The Union's preservation also reshaped national memory. Each side remembered the war differently, crafting narratives that justified sacrifice and loss. In the North, the war became a story of unity saved and freedom advanced. In the South, it was remembered as a tragedy of defeat and devastation, often stripped of its connection to slavery. These competing memories influenced culture, education, and politics for generations, shaping how Americans understood their past and each other. Economically, the war accelerated industrialization and modernization. Northern industries expanded to meet wartime demands, laying the foundation for America's rise as an industrial power. Railroads connected regions more tightly than ever before. New technologies and methods of organization emerged from the necessities of war, transforming labor and production. The nation moved forward, but not evenly, as disparities between regions deepened. The idea of citizenship itself was transformed. Before the war, rights were often defined by state law and social status. After the war, citizenship became a national identity with constitutional protections. This shift expanded the promise of America, even as its fulfillment remained incomplete. The meaning of being American grew broader, more complex, and more contested. The preservation of the Union did not erase division, but it set the terms under which future struggles would occur. Disputes over rights, power, and equality would continue, but they would unfold within a single nation, not between separate ones. The war ensured that debates about America's future would be fought through law, protest, and politics rather than secession and open rebellion. The United States emerged from the Civil War unified by force and altered by experience. The conflict redefined its purpose and possibilities, binding its fate more tightly together than ever before. What survived was not just a nation, but an evolving idea of what that nation could become, shaped by sacrifice, struggle, and the unresolved legacy of a war that changed everything. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.